Have you ever found yourself whispering, God, I'm doing everything right, so why does this still feel off? You're showing up, you're giving, you're loving well, you're trying to live with integrity, and yet something feels misaligned. It's quiet, it's heavy, it's simply unsettled. You're experiencing that feeling of being suspended. You still see God's provision. You still recognize His grace. You know He's near because somehow things keep working out. But deep down, you're wondering why your spirit doesn't feel at rest. If you've ever thought, God, I know you're with me, but I don't feel you the way I used to, this conversation is for you. Welcome to the iLEAD Misti Blue Podcast. I'm Misti Green, and I'm glad you're here. Pull up a chair, the table is set. A few months ago, I was in a conversation with my sister, one of those transparent and unguarded moments where truth rises without effort. And she gently reminded me of the difference between God's permissive will and God's perfect will. That conversation has stayed with me because sometimes we aren't outside of God's will at all. We're just living in what He's allowed, not what He's intended, not what He's ordained. See, God in His grace, He will allow us to choose paths that still carry covering, but that doesn't always mean they carry His peace. And that brings us to today's conversation, permissible or perfect, when God allows but does not author. There's a difference between what God allows and what God ordains. And if we're honest, most of us spend a good portion of our lives confusing the two. We mistake provision for approval and we confuse movement with alignment. We interpret survival as success. But just because God permits something, it doesn't mean it's His perfect will. And today I want to talk about that difference through one of the most misunderstood stories in Scripture. We're going to be talking about Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac. Talk about a situation. Because this story isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. And if we're brave enough to look into it, it will show us where we've settled, where we have rushed, and where God has been patiently waiting for us to release control and trust Him fully. God made Abraham a promise. It was a big one. I will make you a great nation. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. But there was a problem. Time kept passing. Sarah, his wife, remained barren, and the promise felt delayed. And delay, when mixed with desire, can become dangerous. Because waiting doesn't just test faith. Waiting exposes fear. So Sarah does what many of us do when waiting starts to ache and impatience takes root. She tries to help God out. She offers Hagar, who at the time was essentially Sarah's servant, a woman without choice. And Abraham agrees. And this is where we often misunderstand God's will, because God did not stop them. He allowed it, but that doesn't mean He approved it. And this is what God's permissive will, not perfect will, can look like. And that distinction matters far more than we realize, because permissive will rarely announce itself as rebellion. It usually shows up as a reason, as logic, as a workaround that feels maybe compassionate or rational in the moment. Hagar becomes pregnant and her son Ishmael is born. On the surface, it looks like the promise is being fulfilled and Abraham has a descendant. So there's movement. There's evidence of what God had spoken. There's something to show for the patience and the waiting, but something's off. Something is unsettled. Peace is missing, and the atmosphere changes. There's tension and jealousy. There's comparison and pain. And there's extreme displacement. Because when we move ahead of God, we may get something, but it's rarely the thing that He intended. The permissive will of God often produces substitutes. They look close enough, they function for a while, they can even carry some level of blessing, but they don't bring peace. And this is where Hagar's story matters. Hagar is often treated like a side character. She was the ultimate side chick, if we want to use today's terminology, but she bears the heaviest cost. She is a servant, a woman with no power, no choice, no voice, no agency. She's not invited into a promise. She's pulled strategically into a plan. Her body becomes the biggest bridge between someone else's impatience and someone else's future. And when she becomes pregnant, the dynamic shifts. Scripture says she begins to despise Sarah. But let's be honest, this isn't arrogance. It is dignity awakening in a system that never allowed her humanity. For the first time, Hagar carries something valued, something wanted, something that gives her weight in a system or a household where she had none. And Sarah, the architect of the whole plan, now she feels threatened. The very thing she orchestrated now causes her pain. Now it wounds her. This is the fruit of permissive will, comparison, competition, bitterness, resentfulness, confusion, chaos. Because when we operate outside of God's perfect will, relationships fracture. Trust will erode, love becomes transactional, and what was never meant to carry life begins to compete for it. Hagar becomes collateral damage, if you will, in someone else's fear. She is mistreated, she is pressured, and she is pushed until she runs. Pregnant, alone, displaced. She ends up in the wilderness, not because God led her there, but because permissive choices pushed her there. And yet grace shows up. The angel of the Lord finds Hagar by a spring in the desert. She wasn't in safety. She was definitely not in certainty. She was in survival. And Hagar names God El Roi, the God who sees me. This is permissive grace. God does not abandon her. He does not shame her. He does not ignore the injustice done to her. He sees her. He speaks to her. He promises survival for her son Ishmael. Grace sustains her in a place God did not design. This is suspension held by grace, but it's not yet settled. Years later, Hagar is sent away again, this time with Ishmael. No protection, no vision, no clear future. The water runs out. Scripture tells us something devastatingly human. She places her son under a bush and turns away because she cannot bear to watch him die. This is not weakness. This is a mother at the end of survival. Have any of you been there before? And God hears the cry, not the cry of Abraham, not the cry or regret of Sarah, the cry of the child. And God opens Hagar's eyes to a well. Provision was there, but pain had narrowed her vision. This is the truth about permissive will. It can keep you alive, but it often keeps you in survival mode. Grace will meet you there. Grace may even cover you while you're there. And it might even sustain you, but grace does not always bring you home. Then there's Isaac, the child of promise, the one born not through striving, but through surrender. By the time Isaac comes, Sarah is beyond what makes sense biologically. There is no mistaking that this is God. This is the promised child to Abraham and Sarah. And that's often how his perfect will works. It removes our ability to take credit. It forces trust. It can humble us, and it requires waiting, and patience. The perfect will of God is rarely efficient, but it is always intentional. Isaac's lineage becomes the line through which covenant, promise, and redemption flow. Through Isaac comes Jacob, through Jacob, the 12 tribes, through the lineage, Christ. That's the fruit of obedience. The fruit spoke, not ease, not speed, but alignment. And when you're in God's perfect will, there is covering, but there is also clarity. There is peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. There is provision that doesn't come with striving. It doesn't mean it's easy. It means it's anchored. And here's the difference. In permissive will, grace sustains you. In perfect will, mercy restores you. Grace will help you survive what God allowed, but mercy ushers you into what God authored. Here's the part we don't like to talk about. Obedience is lonely. When you're walking in God's perfect will, there are seasons of silence, seasons of waiting, seasons of pruning, seasons of stillness. And stillness can feel like abandonment. This is where the enemy gets loud. He whispers, nothing's happening, you're behind, you missed it, and other people are moving forward. But silence doesn't mean absence, and waiting doesn't mean wasted. God often does his deepest work when nothing around you is moving. This is why obedience feels costly, because it often asks you to release things that feel good, that feel comforting, that even feel loving. But not everything that feels good is God. And obedience sometimes means letting go of something that's feeding your loneliness instead of healing it. The permissive will fills space. The perfect will fills purpose. We love to quote Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. It's comforting. It's framed in such a way that it's easy to memorize and it's easy to quote and it's easy to believe. But we often lift that verse out of the story that it's sitting in, because before God ever speaks about prosperity, he speaks about placement. Jeremiah 29 is written to the people in exile. And if you haven't read the book of Jeremiah, let me tell you, it's difficult to get through, but it's powerful. The people in exile, not people being rescued, not people getting quick answers, but people being asked to stay. They are living in Babylon, a place they did not choose, a season they did not expect, and a consequence they did not want. And God does something surprising. He doesn't say, I'll get you out quickly. He doesn't say, this won't be hard. He doesn't say, you can bypass this. Instead, he says, build houses, plant gardens, get married, have children, seek the peace of the city where I've sent you. In other words, live faithfully where you are, even if it isn't ideal. See, that's obedience. That's not permissive will, that's perfect will, because permissive will looks like escape. It looks like exiting this place of discomfort. Perfect will learns how to trust God within the process. And then after that instruction, God says, for I know the plans I have for you. The promise follows obedience, which means obedience is far greater than sacrifice. Hope follows surrender, and prosperity follows alignment. And the word prosper here does not mean ease. It doesn't mean comfort. It doesn't even mean immediate relief. It means shalom, wholeness, completeness, being rightly ordered. Jeremiah 29:11 is not a promise to skip the process. It's a promise that the process is not pointless. It's God saying, if you will stay with me here, if you will obey me here, if you will trust me here, I will not waste this season. This is perfect will theology. Not rushing the outcome, not feeling the silence, not forcing relief, but trusting that obedience, even in exile, is shaping something deeper than circumstance. The permissive will of God will let you move ahead. It will even let you stay suspended. It will let you survive in your suspension. But the perfect will of God, that's where He shapes you. That's where He refines you. And He aligns your life with His design. It won't always be loud and it won't always be fast, but it will be anchored. You will be settled. If you're in a season where things feel quiet, where you're resisting the urge to fill the space, where obedience feels costly and even lonely, you may not be behind. Sometimes suspension belongs to the permissive. You're moving but not grounded. And settlement belongs to the perfect, where your spirit finally comes to rest. You remain anchored and still. You may be right on time, because the perfect will of God often feels like waiting until suddenly it becomes fulfillment. And when it comes, it doesn't just bless you, it blesses generations. So if you're standing at the crossroads between what's easy and what's right, between what's available and what's appointed, choose what God is authoring. Seek Him for clarity and trust Him with the timing. Because God doesn't just meet us there. He walks ahead of us in His perfect will.